Sure. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Cyber Psychology Seminar Series. My name is Dr. Julie Ansis, and I'm professor and inaugural director of the Cyber Psychology program at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. The Cyber Psychology Seminar Series is designed to showcase the many different facets of research and scholarship within the field of cyber psychology. The series features some of the nation's leading experts at the emerging intersection of psychology and technology. A bit of housekeeping before we get started formally. Please keep your mic on mute, and we'll have a question and answer period primarily in the last 15 to 20 minutes of today's talk, but Dr. Matz has graciously agreed to be interrupted if necessary. And she will also help monitor the chat, although I know that's challenging when you're talking. So just put your questions in the chat and we will read them during her presentation or after her presentation, depending on the nature of the questions and the lecture. It is a pleasure to have you, Dr. Sandra Matz. Dr. Matz is the David Zalaznick Associate Professor of Business at Columbia University Business School in New York City. As a computational social scientist, she studies human behavior and preferences using a combination of big data analytics and traditional experimental methods. Her research aims at understanding how psychological characteristics influence real-life outcomes in a number of business-related domains, such as financial well-being, consumer satisfaction, or team performance, with the goal of helping businesses and individuals to make better decisions. Dr. Matz was named one of the Data IQ's 100 most influential people in data-driven marketing in 2015 and 2016, and was recognized as one of the 30 top thinkers under 30 by the Pacific Standard magazine. The title of her talk today is Using Big Data to Study Individual Differences in Spending. So I'm going to turn it over to you and welcome.
Thank you so much, Professor Ansis. It's amazing to be here. Obviously, it would have been nice to do this in person, but I'm glad that we at least got the chance to do this virtually. So I'm excited to be here, talk about some of the work that I've been doing over the last couple of years now, in the context really at the intersection of psychology, business, and computer science. So let me just start sharing my screen. So yeah, I titled the talk, Using Big Data to Study Individual Differences in Spending Behavior. Most of my research is really focused at trying to see what is it that people do on a daily basis, right? So as psychologists, we call ourselves behavioral scientists, but for the longest time, it was really difficult to get a sense of what is it that people are actually doing out there in the wild on a daily basis. So that's where I'm going to come back to this again in the talk, where I really see that big data just offers amazing opportunities. So when we started this entire field of big data, computational social science, I think in the beginning, there was a lot of hype around big data, and it was just sexy to call yourself a data scientist or data analyst. But I do think that there's really something fundamental about the way that we can now look at these traces that people leave on a daily basis, and with pretty much every step that they take online, whether that's social media, whether that's smartphones, whether that's credit card spending. And that really gives us this glimpse into what their lives look like and what their psychology looks like. And what I did for this specific talk, to make it somewhat more concrete and have this line flow through it, is to kind of focus on spending behavior. So the reason why I got excited about spending behavior is there's a couple of reasons. But one of the main ones is that I feel like there's so much room for improvement, right? So if we think about spending, we're oftentimes not very good at dealing with our finances. So we're very quick to spend money. We're not really good at saving money. Most of us don't necessarily have a good understanding of how to invest our money. How do we actually make our money work for us rather than just kind of constantly clocking the hours to get more money. So it's really this idea of how do we think about money as a means to have a more fulfilling life, to make us happier, to get the things that we actually want, instead of just kind of constantly trying to get more money, which is not necessarily helping us be happier. So that was one of the reasons why I initially got excited, because I felt like there's so much room for improvement when it comes to the human experience around spending, because we all do it. And the second reason, which I realized more and more as I got into this topic, was really that spending in a way is extremely personal, right? You can almost think of it as like this fingerprint. And one of my favorite studies, which is coming out of the computer sciences, not necessarily psychology, is showing that it takes only 3 data points to uniquely identify a person in credit card metadata. So if I know, for example, that David, like the person I see on my screen, David went at 7:50 in the morning to Starbucks on 72nd and Amsterdam, I'm just picking a random Starbucks now, then had lunch in a specific place and took an Uber downtown in the evening to have a cocktail somewhere, then it's very likely that there's only one person in this entire universe of people living in Manhattan who has that specific spending, right? So if you combine what we buy with when we buy it and where we buy it, these spending records very quickly become so unique, leave such a unique signature that we can say, okay, this is David. If I know these 3 data points, I can identify you in that spending data. But what is also interesting, I think, from a psychological point of view, is that there's oftentimes clusters of spending, right? So you would assume that the way that 15-year-old girls in Brooklyn spend their money is somewhat different from the way that, I don't know, like pensioners in Ohio spend their money. So it really tells us spending to some extent, it's not just functional, but it tells us something about who we are. And this was, I think, nicely captured in this quote by Levy, I think published in the Harvard Business Year Review, where he said that people buy things not only for what they can do, but also for what they mean, right? So the idea is that spending is not just functional, it has this meaning, it has this symbolic property that allows us to express to the world, to ourselves, who we are. So one of the questions that I got interested in as a personality psychologist by training was, how do these relatively stable personality traits relate to spending, right? So how does who we are, how does that get expressed in spending, and vice versa? How can we kind of learn something about who we are by just observing spending in a broader context of, again, how can we use big data to observe some of these things? And this is a quote that I really like. It always helps me make the point about why big data is important without having to say this myself. But this is published in The Economist, like the web will revolutionize social science, just as the microscope and telescope transformed the natural sciences. And obviously that's a pretty big statement. But I do think it's true in many ways. Again, coming back to what I said in the beginning, is that we can now get this extremely detailed and naturally valid understanding of what is it that people do on a daily basis. So instead of looking out into the stars, we can actually look inside and see how do people express themselves? How do they interact? How do they interact with one another? How do they interact with the digital world? So all of these questions that were previously difficult to answer, we can now to some extent answer just by looking at these traces that people leave. And the way that I think big data can really help psychologists and social scientists more generally is in these 3 different ways. So one is, and this is like how I'm going to structure the talk. So I'm going to talk about some of the findings in the context of spending in each of these 3 buckets. The first one is taking big data as the output. And this is something that I think we're used to most often or most frequently in existing research, but it's essentially saying, can we see how personality or individual differences influence our behavior, and we capture the behavior by looking at people's digital footprint. So in this case, like the question that I'm asking is, does personality fit increase spending and satisfaction? I'm going to say more about the details in just a second. Then we're going to flip this. So essentially now we're looking at digital footprints as the input. And the question is, can we, by simply observing someone's digital traces, so that could be their Facebook profiles, again, credit card spending, smartphone sensing data, can we take these behavioral indicators to learn something about the psychology of someone? And then in the final part, we're bringing this all together. And for me, this is the most interesting part in a way. It's essentially saying, can we use digital footprints to make inferences about who someone is? So can I take your Facebook likes, make a prediction, for example, about who you are in terms of your psychology, and then can I use these insights in return to influence your behavior in a certain way, which I can then again measure using digital footprints. So in this case, for example, can I understand your psychology based on your Facebook likes, and can I use this understanding to target you with personalized marketing content such that you're then more likely to take action and buy something? So for me, this is the most interesting part in a way, because it means that we can now study these individual differences at scale, right? So we're no longer restricted to questionnaires, but we can also, instead of just purely observing relationships, we can now start intervening, and we can start seeing how do these insights about who you are, how does it help us to influence, manipulate, if you want to take it to the negative extreme side, your behavior, and really get you to take action in a certain way, change your attitudes, change the way that you think about the world. So I'm going to start with the first one. And this is a paper that was actually published while I was still doing my PhD at the University of Cambridge. It's a collaboration with Joe Gladstone and David Stilwell. And the idea behind it was really kind of trying to see, how does our personality influence our spending, right? How does who we are, how does it influence what we purchase and what we spend our money on? And one of the main premises of this research, and this is like a question that I'm not going to go into too much detail of, was this idea that people spend more money on products that match their personality, right? So the idea that if you are extroverted, for example, you might be more likely to spend your money on going to the bar, going to kind of doing things that are social, things that kind of involve a lot of energy, a lot of excitement, a lot of other people. And if you're introverted, you might be more likely to spend things on something like books or something that kind of allows you to have some quality me time at home. So this was the premise of the paper, and the idea was coming from this entire literature on psychological fit, which suggests that, again, we are more likely to have friends who are similar to ourselves, or we're more likely to live in a residential neighborhood that is to some extent reflective of who we are. So we found evidence for that. I don't want to talk too much about it because it's not the part of the paper that I found the most interesting. And the part that for me was probably more interesting was the question of, does spending money in a way that fits your personality lead to increased life satisfaction, right? So it's this idea that if you manage to spend your money in a way that allows you to fulfill your psychological needs, again, like extroverts having the social time with like other people, does that help you get something out of the money that you make? And it comes in a tradition of quite a couple of decades of research that was looking into this idea of, well, money doesn't seem to buy us happiness per se. So it's not that if we earn a ton of money or if we spend a lot of money, we're not necessarily happier. And Liz Dunn, who's at UBC in Vancouver, and Mike Norton, who's on a different paper, what they suggested is that essentially, if money isn't buying us happiness, maybe it's because we're not spending it right. Right, so we're just kind of mindlessly spending money, but we're not necessarily spending it in a way that helps us satisfy our fundamental psychological needs. So this was the idea of the paper. And the way that we looked at this was in collaboration with a bank that was based in the UK. So we got access to some of their customers, and those are just the customers for which we eventually had all the data. But what they allowed us to do was survey their customers. So we got information about the self-reported personality traits. So again, how did these customers see themselves in terms of their psychological needs and preferences? We got a measure of life satisfaction. And the interesting part is that also we got access to their transaction records for the 6 months preceding the survey. So we kind of knew exactly what they spent their money on, how much they spent, and quite conveniently, these transactions already came pre-classified in 59 categories. So that could be something like books, that could be entertainment. So every bank has like their own classification system, but it really allowed us to map like who the person is in terms of personality, what they spend their money on, and then combine the two to predict life satisfaction. So let me just quickly walk you through the way that we did this, because the question really was, if there's an alignment between a person and their spending, does that lead to increased life satisfaction? And the way that we measured individual personality is a standard short questionnaire that is psychometrically sound and validated. And so statements like, I see myself as someone who is reserved, and then you just ask people how much they agree with the statement. The personality of the spending was somewhat more, I mean, as a personality psychologist, I would say challenging, because there's no off-the-shelf ways for doing that. There is quite a bit of research on this in the context of the consumer behavior literature. So the way that we looked at the personality of spending is essentially that we had a separate set of, I think, 200 people from Amazon Mechanical Turk rate these categories. So we kind of gave them a category, let's say books, and we told them if the spending category was a person, which characteristics would it have? And then we gave them the personality items that we also use for people to rate themselves on these personality traits. Again, like if you show this to personality psychologists for the first time, they're like, this sounds really weird. Like, how could you rate an object based on human personality traits? But there's quite a bit of literature establishing that we often imbue objects and brands and products and services with these personal characteristics. And what I'm showing you here is that the ratings, first of all, they're pretty consistent across people. So we all have a relatively shared understanding of what the personality of these categories is. And they also have really good face validity, so they make sense, right? So in this case, I'm showing you the personality profile of a book and the personality profile of entertainment on the big 5 personality traits. So you have openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And you can see that both books and entertainment are rated highly on openness to experience, which makes sense. But then entertainment, for example, is rated much higher on extroversion than books, right? So the association that we have with entertainment is much more social, much more outgoing than the associations that we have for books. So now that we have the two, we have human personality, we have the personality of spending categories. The question is, how do we combine the two? And there's different ways in which you can do this. The way that we chose in this case is we kind of used Euclidean distance. And the way that you can think of this, I've just now collapsed the personality space of 5 dimensions into 3 dimensions, because it's really hard to imagine and visualize 5 dimensions, but just imagine that this was done across all of the big 5 traits. So you have the big 5 profile of a specific person, so you can plot this person in the personality space. And now, because we measured the spending categories for each of these different categories in the personality for each of these categories in the same space, we can now plot them for each person, their unique spending categories in that space. And we can, because we're interested in the overall spending of a person. So what does the overall spending of a person look like in terms of personality? We can now average those personality profiles of the unique categories that a person had spent money on and get a personality of what we call the shopping basket, right? So it's the average profile of the spending of a particular person. And now we simply look at the distance. So how close is my own personality to the personality of my spending? And that's what we're using as the independent variable, as the predictor in the model. And what we find, so again, now we're predicting life satisfaction at the end of the 6 months from this fit between the person's personality and their spending brackets personality. And what you see is that there is the significant positive effect that we had been expecting, such that if your spending is more closely aligned with your personality, you kind of get this boost in life satisfaction. A couple of caveats here. So actually, like, one thing that I think was very nice to see is that we also looked at the impact of income and total spend on people's satisfaction, and there's no effect, right? So again, this idea that it's not how much money you have, it's not how much money you spend that predicts whether you're satisfied with your life. It's really whether you manage to align your spending in a way such that it kind of fulfills your psychological needs. A bunch of caveats here. One is, like, if you look at the effect size, tiny. So it's really small effect, which is not surprising because this was a super noisy study, right? So you kind of look at transactions over the period of 6 months, then you look at their happiness. So in terms of, like, when you use big data, and I think that's a more general point, when you use big data, you oftentimes can't compare effect sizes the way that you would expect them to happen in the lab. The fact that we're finding anything here in this noisy data is actually an indicator that there is quite a bit of signal here. Second caveat, which also in some way speaks to the first one, is that obviously this is purely correlational. So we can't really make any strong claims about causality. Could be that people who are happier just are better at recognizing their needs and therefore are able to align their spending more. So we followed up this initial study with an experiment where we invited people to the lab, like classic social psych experiment, where we assigned them randomly to conditions, spending on a mismatched and a matched product, and we replicated the effect. But what I think is important here, and this is one thing that I always like to highlight, because I think it's criticism that I got a lot in the beginning when I started working with big data, is this idea of like, oh, all big data is correlational and you can't really prove causation, or like all of your effect sizes are super small. And I really think that if you are a person who's interested in working with big data, nobody prevents you from combining the best of two worlds, right? So nobody's saying the only thing that you do is just use big data and then kind of you're limited to now a new method and you can't use any of the other methods in the toolbox. That's just not true. So I think the best studies and the best papers that I see out there, they just have a combination. They say, look, big data offers me the opportunity to study things in the real world, show that they have a real impact, show that this is something that really matters out there in real life. But then you can still take it to the lab and say, okay, now we're kind of exploring the causal effects, or we're exploring the mechanisms. And oftentimes what we see is that effect sizes that are small in your big data set, they become much bigger in a classical experiment, just because everything is so much more controlled. So I would just encourage you, don't let people tell you that if you're using big data, that's the only thing you do, and you can never look at causality, because you can always go back to the lab and show it there. Okay, so here's a follow-up that we ran that I just think is interesting, both theoretically and in terms of the methods. That's why I wanted to include it here. That's worked with a couple of people, most notably Friedrich Götz and Tobias Ebert. And the idea here was that, like, my initial research had really focused on how does my own personality shape my spending. But we also know that spending is social, right? So there's like social influence, there's cultural norms, there's social expectations, there's social networks. We're more likely to do stuff that our friends are doing. So how does that factor into this idea that personality is influencing what we spend our money on? And in a way, if you think about it, so this is Levine's field theory, super traditional, kind of saying that behavior is a function of both the person and the environment, right? So this idea of person-environment interaction, our spending should be influenced by who I am, but also by our environment, the environment that I'm embedded in. And personality, for most of the history of personality science, has been purely a function of the person, right? So a person has a big five profile. And what we're suggesting in this paper is that we can also think of the environment of a person in terms of personality. And the way that we do this in this particular paper is that we essentially look at what is the personality of the people around you. So what is the personality of the people who live in the same county? What is the personality who live in the same neighborhood? And how does the personality of you, in combination with the personality of everybody around you, how is that influencing your spending? And the way that we do this is, so this is a pretty neat data set. Again, kind of a collaboration with a big bank. So we got access to more than 31 million unique transactions from more than 100,000 participants. And what we knew about these participants is essentially where they lived. So this is a study in the UK, and we knew in which, think of it as a county, in which county in the UK these people lived. And what you can do now, and this is data coming from a different data set, so we're now combining data sources, is that there is a huge data set that was like run in collaboration with the BBC. It was like personality survey. They had about 400,000 people across the UK complete these personality questionnaires. So this is a data set that's out there, that's available. And what we can do now is we can kind of, for each of these counties, average all the people who have completed the personality survey and say this particular county is on average more extroverted, more introverted, more open-minded, less open-minded than other counties in the UK. What's interesting about this data set is that we also had access to the individual level data of a small subset of people, still about 2,000 customers of the bank, for which we had information both about where they lived and their self-reported personality. So in the first step, what we did is we looked at what is prototypical spending of different personality traits. So we just looked at what are the spending categories that are most strongly correlated with openness, for example, or conscientiousness and extroversion. And you can see that they do make quite a bit of sense. So extroversion is related to spending money on dining and drinking, on clothes, hairdressing, gym membership. So a lot of the things that are more outward facing and outgoing. And then, so now we're looking at in the first step, we just looked at the geographic level. So the question was, are regions in the UK where people on average, so what I'm showing you here is just a personality distribution of people who completed the questionnaire. So are those regions, for example, and the little blob in the bottom right, that's London. So you see that London is scores high on openness. So it's much more liberal. It's also much more extroverted than other parts of the UK. A little bit less agreeable, which also makes sense because it's like a financial center. So they're just a little bit more competitive, right? So this is just a distribution of personality across the UK. And what you can do now is map that against the spending of people in these regions. So we can now say, okay, how prototypically open-minded is the spending in a specific region? How prototypically extroverted is the spending in a different region? And you can already see that there's a pretty strong overlap, right? So in regions where people say that they're more extroverted or think that they're more extroverted, they also spend their money in a way that is prototypically extroverted. But the real question that I think all of us were the most excited about was really this question of how much of my individual spending is determined by my own personality versus the personality around us. So it's like really this kind of person versus environment, and do these two interact? And what we find, and I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but if you just look at the first line, we replicate this idea that your individual level personality is predictive of what you spend your money on. That's not super surprising. We've shown this before. But we also show in the second line that the same is true for regional personality, right? So all of these coefficients are positive. So what that means is that if you live in a county that's more extroverted than other counties, you're also more likely to spend your money in an extroverted way. And that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense just because there's other extroverted people around you, right? So there's social influence. It could also be that regions where there's like higher levels of extroversion, they just have more affordances. So there might be more bars, there might be more restaurants, there might be more, all of these institutions that allow you to be extroverted. But it was really nice to see that, again, like your behavior is influenced by the personality of yourself, but also by the personality of people around you. Okay, so now we're flipping this on its head. Let me make sure. If there's any questions, just put them in the chat and I'll try to see them and answer them. But like we're now moving to the second stage where we're essentially flipping it on its head, and instead of looking at behavior as the output, we're now looking at it as the input, right? So can I observe your spending records, for example, and tell whether you're extroverted, whether you're introverted? And based on everything that I've shown you, it's already, we have a pretty good sense that this should be possible. But let me take a step back before I dive into spending and briefly give you an overview of where this field is right now. So this is a field that's been around for like a little less than 10 years now. And it's this idea that we can observe your digital footprints, so all of the traces that you leave as you interact with the internet, digital devices more and more generally, and we can turn these digital footprints into predictions of psychological traits. So we can predict, for example, personality, values, political ideology, sexual orientation. So all of the things that are relatively intimate and private psychological traits, we can now glean just by looking at your digital profile. And that includes Facebook likes, status updates, so language, tweets, also includes profile pictures and faces, right? So if you think about Instagram pictures that you post, they might reveal something about not just how you feel in the moment, but also who you are as a more stable individual. Smartphone data, so we can look at GPS data, for example, and see what are the places that you visit, how much physical activity is there, how much time do you spend at home, or how many calls do you make, probably an indication of you being more extroverted. And we can do the same thing in the context of spending. And I'm not going to go into detail of the algorithms that lie behind this, right? So you could, in a way, you can think of it as a simple regression. You just kind of take all of the data that you have observed about people's behavior, you use them as predictors, and you predict people's self-reported personality. The models that you're using are slightly more complicated just because you have so much data. If we're working with Facebook likes, for example, you typically have a data set that has like 30,000 columns because there's so many different likes that people might or might not follow on Facebook that your standard regression just breaks down at some point. I don't want to go into detail. What I want you to show you is essentially some of these relationships that are underlying the predictions that we're making, because I think that is in a way a lot more interesting. So what I'm showing you here, and it's not my own work, this is work by Andy Schwartz and Greg Park, but the idea here is that we're looking at people's status updates. So those are the things that people post on Facebook. And these are the words that are most strongly correlated with extroversion. So it's not that extroverted people use these words all the time. It just means if you talk about love, parties, weekend, amazing girls, you are more likely to be extroverted than the average person, right? And this is like amazing face validity. So you see like extroverts talk about all these social and exciting things. If you contrast that to introversion, you see that it looks quite different, right? So introverts who are much more reserved and quiet, they talk about anime, manga, internet, reading, books, all of the things that you typically do by yourself. So even if you just look at these two word clouds without using any machine learning, no rocket science, absolutely nothing, you already get a sense that, well, the way that people express themselves online really to some extent is associated with their psychological traits. Now here's one of my favorites, which is the personality trait of agreeableness. So those are people who are trusting, who are caring, who nurture their social relationships. And again, you can see this reflected in the language that they use. So there's like, it's wonderful, amazing, happy Thanksgiving. It's like this warm glow to everything they say. A word of warning, and I always say this, the word cloud for people who are disagreeable, which means critical, competitive, looks very different. It's essentially like a cloud of swear words, right? And what I should state and highlight, emphasize again, is that it doesn't mean that if you're disagreeable, you swear all the time. All it says is that if you happen to swear on Facebook, that's an indication that you're more competitive and critical than the average person. We can do the same thing for Facebook likes, and this is going to become relevant later in the third part where we can actually use this in an application context. But you see the same pattern again, right? So introverts, they follow pages. So those are official Facebook pages that you can follow. It's like if Lady Gaga has an official Facebook page or Columbia has an official Facebook page, you can follow these pages. It's not when one of your friends posts like a funny animal cat video and you like it. It's really these official pages that we're talking about. But you can see that introversion, all the things that are kind of somewhat more reserved, quiet, you do by yourself, and then extroverts like all these outgoing social stuff. And here's in the context of spending. So you can, I'm just going to show you one example, which is high conscientiousness and low conscientiousness. So you can see high conscientiousness again, like savings, holiday savings. So those are people who are, they kind of are reliable, they're like to plan and so on and so forth. And then the low conscientiousness people who are somewhat more flexible in their approach to life, a little bit more disorganized. They spend their money on cash, on lunch and snacks and takeaway. So you can see how the lifestyle is quite different between someone who just like lives off snacks and someone who allocates a lot of money to spending. And this is, I'm going to come to the question in a second, but this is just a comparison of predictive accuracy. So here, just assume that higher is better. So I told you in the beginning that we have made these predictions from a number of different footprints, right? And you can see that in terms of accuracy, social media profiles just hold the most information. So if you look at people's Facebook likes, status updates, that is pretty predictive. If you then look at spending, if you look at music, if you look at pictures, the accuracy drop. It still holds a substantial amount of signal, but it's much lower. And if you think about this from a psychological point of view, I think what's interesting is that there's this distinction in the psychological literature between identity claims and behavioral residue. So identity claims are explicit statements that you make about yourself, right? If I put up a poster of someone, it's like a pretty explicit sign of like, this is someone who I want to be associated with. And versus behavioral residue, these are like subtle cues that you just inadvertently leave as you go about your life. So if I just leave a note on the table without thinking about it, this might say something about me, or the fact that my room is totally disorganized. I don't organize my socks by color. It just means that maybe I'm not as organized as someone else. And what you see here is that Facebook, I mean, all the social media platforms, they're very strong on identity claims, right? They're very explicit signals of here's who I am, and this is what I want to signal to the outside world. So they hold a lot of value when you predict self-reports, which is in a way intuitive, right? Because we're benchmarking it against how do people see themselves and how they want to be seen by other people. So the fact that identity claims are really strong here makes a lot of sense. Behavioral residue, on the other hand, like spending, credit card spending, and pictures is like a little bit of a weird mix, but songs that we listen to, they're much more subtle in the way that we express ourselves, and they're not necessarily meant to signal to others who we are. And they do have the potential advantage that they're less biased, right? So they're not as curated, they're just they just happen. But it also means that if we're trying to predict self-reports, that they might not be as predictive than these identity claims. I think an interesting question that that research hasn't really looked at as much is this idea of, well, okay, identity claims might be better at predicting how I see myself, but are they also better at predicting what I actually do when it comes to other outcomes? Because in this case, maybe behavioral residue, which are less curated, less biased by our desire to present ourselves in a positive light, maybe they are just as good as predicting these external outcomes as identity claims. Oh, now I see the the question in the chat. It could be. I don't. So I think this is like an empirical question, but I think it's a funny thought. Okay, let me move on because I want to get to this third part, which I think is the most interesting one, which is really the combination of the two worlds, right? So we're taking digital footprints to make predictions about who someone is, and then we're using that insight to influence their behavior and measure whether that had an impact on their behavior moving forward. So this is a paper in collaboration with Mio Kaczynski, Gidi Nave, who's at Wharton, and David Stilwell again. And it's one of the earlier works that I did in the context of what I call psychological targeting. So the idea that we're predicting someone's profile and then we're using that insight to kind of try and get them to do something that we want them to do. And obviously, like everything that I say now probably sounds quite familiar because that's the scandal around Cambridge Analytica that erupted in the context of the 2016 presidential election, where they had claimed, or Cambridge Analytica had claimed, that they had kind of profiled millions of US voters, then used that information to target them with personalized advertising on Facebook to, in this case, discourage them from putting in their vote for Hillary Clinton, right? So this is research, what I should say, this is research that started way before then. We've been talking about this for quite some time, trying to get policymakers and the public aware of this is something that was possible. Not that many people listened until Cambridge Analytica happened. And it was really nice that we had this research already in our back pockets to say, look, there's a debate going on what happened. Nobody really knows if this is feasible, if it's possible, if it's effective. And here's a response that actually suggests, forget about whether Cambridge Analytica did it or not. If you were to do it right now, it's likely that it would be effective in changing people's attitudes and changing people's behavior. So there's a couple of questions that you can ask in this context. I'm only going to focus on one. But the question is essentially, can we increase the effectiveness of Facebook advertising campaigns? So getting people to take action, click on something, and then potentially purchase something by targeting people with products that match their personality. So that's what I call product matching. And that goes back to the first part of the talk that I showed you, right, is that people are more likely to spend money on things that match their personality. So you could imagine if I want to sell if I want to kind of advertise my bookstore, I'm going to try to target introverts because they're the ones who fit the bill. The other part of this, which I think in a way is more interesting, is can we, instead of matching the product, can we simply change the way that we talk about a specific product such that it appeals more or less to different types of personalities? And that's the research that I'm going to focus on here. Taking a step back, I'm going to talk about the experimental design in just a second, but one of the questions is, how do we implement this, right? So if I get access to your entire Facebook history and your Facebook likes, I can run it through my machine learning algorithm and predict that you're extroverted, open-minded, agreeable, whatnot. But how do we actually implement this in the context of targeted advertising? Now, one of the ways in which you can do that is to essentially take those Facebook likes, which I told you before are associated with extroversion and introversion, for example, and then we can leverage the existing targeting platform that Facebook offers. So this is a screenshot from the Facebook targeting platform. A few years back, it might look slightly different now, but same functionality, right? So anyone with a Facebook account can run ads, and you can target those ads based on socio-demographics, so age, gender, language, where the person lives. But you can also target based on interests. So you can kind of say, I want my ad to reach people who are interested in certain topics. And what you can do now is essentially say, okay, I know that certain interests are associated with being extroverted. I know that certain interests are associated with being introverted. Now I'm going to pop these interests into that section. And by doing so, I tell Facebook, I only want my ad to be sent out to people who are connected to at least one of these interests. And thereby you can define an audience that is somewhat more extroverted or somewhat more introverted without having to have Facebook explicitly allow you to do so. And it's what I should say, it's an incredibly crude way of doing this, right? So I have minimal information about people. All I know is that they're connected to at least one of these likes. So it's really, we're looking at the group level. I don't know anything about the people in that group. And it's likely that it's quite noisy because someone could be related to socializing, but could also like something that is more introverted. So it's really the absolute minimalistic targeting intervention that we can do here in terms of our accuracy of identifying these personality traits. We validated this before. The approach works in terms of getting groups of people who are different in their personality. And then what we did here is we teamed up with a beauty retailer in the UK, and their goal was to get women to click on the ad, go to the online store and purchase something. So there was no specific product associated with the campaign. It was all they wanted to do is get women to engage with the ad, go to the store and buy something. So it's the same product, right? And now we're just kind of trying to see, can we describe the product in different ways such that it appeals more or less to certain personality traits. And they had an amazing creative team, which is really nice to work with. So they came up with 5 extroverted ads, 5 introverted ads. And you can see that, again, they make a lot of sense, and we piloted them, we validated them. But like all of the extroverted ones, there's like something going on. It was like exciting. There's a group of people. And the text would say something like dance like no one's watching, but they totally are. So playing with the need of extroverts to be the center of attention. And then the introverted ones would always be one woman in like a much more reserved and quiet setting. And the copy would say something like beauty doesn't have to shout. So it's really this idea that beauty can be something that is just for you. It's not necessarily about this outgoing world and impressing everybody else. The experimental design is super simple, like a 2x2. So we had these 2 different target groups on Facebook defined by the list of likes, so introverts and extroverts. We had persuasive messages that were tailored to extroversion and introversion. And the assumption was that if the message framing matches the personality of the target audience, so introverts receiving introverted messages, extroverts receiving extroverted messages, that this would actually lead to high levels of engagement and eventually more purchases in these matching conditions. And that's essentially what we found. Let me just quickly walk you through this graph here. So first of all, this was a campaign that was live. So this is a real campaign over 7 days that was run in the UK, I think in 2015. It had more than 6 million impressions. So that's the number of times the ad was shown, about 10,000 clicks and 400 conversions. So that's a conversion, in this case, is a purchase. So a woman went to the website, purchased something that gets registered by Facebook as a conversion, you see that the number of purchases is really small. And that's just because it was an expensive beauty retailer. So the average amount that people spend when they made a purchase, I think, was about $70. So you can see that the absolute conversion rates are really small, just because for every purchase, there was like a lot of money involved. So if you were to plot this graph in terms of return on investment, so how much money did the company make, it looks exactly the same. So it was a pretty successful campaign. But what you see here on the y-axis is the conversion rate. So this is the number of people who purchased something compared to how many people saw the ad. So it just means the higher the better, right? Because more people purchase something. And you can, the green bars are the matching conditions. So introverts purchasing, introverts seeing introverted messages, extroverts seeing extroverted messages. And you can see that those ones are higher than the mismatching ones. So really this idea that if take the same product, the way that you describe it in terms of personality traits really makes a difference in terms of how people perceive the product, their subjective experience of the product, and whether they're likely to take action in terms of clicking and purchasing one of these products later on. And again, this is like the entire setup is such a minimalistic intervention, because the only thing that we tailored was just the ad. So once people clicked on the ad, the website looked exactly the same for everybody. So it's really, they kind of saw the ad, formed an impression of what the beauty retailer stands for, and then that influenced their behavior in terms of purchasing. So we had, this is like, we replicated this in study 2 with a different personality trait, but then in the context of consumer behavior, people are always going to say, well, but we have our existing behavioral targeting tools and they're the best because they just kind of give us an affinity group that's already interested in this context. So in this case, we actually worked with an app, with a gaming app, and they already had a target audience, which they knew were likely to click on the ad and then download the product. And so what we said is like, well, can we still enrich this marketing effort by understanding the psychologies of these people in your existing target pool, right? So we kind of took these existing interests that they targeted, we mapped them against the data that we had in terms of psychological profiles. Unsurprisingly, we figured out that people were more introverted. Again, this is like computer gaming we saw before is somewhat introverted. And now what we said is, okay, we just take your standard messaging. The targeting is exactly the same. The people who we're reaching are exactly the same, but we just kind of changed the message. So your standard targeting is what you've been using all the time. And now we kind of, based on our understanding that the group is introverted, let's come up with messaging that's more geared towards introversion. And here's, again, we kind of ran this campaign over the course of over a couple of days. And we see that exactly the same target audience, just understanding who that audience is in terms of their psychology and tailoring the message leads to this increase in how often people download the app in this case. In this case, it was app installs. Okay, so we've kind of come full circle, kind of gone through all of these things. One of the recent projects that I'm very excited about, and it's like in this realm of the last bucket, is this idea that like a lot of my research has focused on spending, right? So how do people spend their money? How can we get them to spend more on certain things? But to some extent, what really interests me is like, how can we help people make better decisions? So we essentially took the exact same approach of personality matching and this message matching to encourage people to save more. So we can tell people, look, if you save some money today, you can actually spend it on like this amazing fun time with your friends in the future. It's going to be super exciting once COVID is over. You can allocate it to something social that's exciting with your friends. And then we tell introverts, for example, that they can spend it on something to make their home feel more comfortable and allow them to make the most of their me time. And this is essentially what we find. It's the same way that we can get people to spend more money by matching messages to their personality. We can also get them to save more money. So it's really this mechanism of understanding your motivation allows me to nudge your behavior in a certain direction by making things more salient and kind of allowing you to have this vision of what could my life look like if I put some money to the side or if I spend some money on a product right now. just a super brief outlook before we dive into the Q&A, but I think where this is going, and this is obviously related to privacy concerns to some extent, but I do think that right now we're thinking of predictions as something that's relatively static, right? So we're predicting you're an extrovert, you're an introvert, but to some extent it's much more flexible. So how extroverted, introverted we are depends on us, but also depends on the situation. And what you see here is the election of the Pope in 2005 and then 2013. And you can see that there's like a crazy picture, because like pretty much everything we do now is mediated through these wearable digital devices like our smartphones. And what's interesting about them is that they really track us continuously, right? So they have a sense of not just who we are, but also the context that we're in. So if you think about your smartphone, it tells me where we are. So if I map that against the internet, I get a sense of, is that a lively location? Is that something where people hang out? I can tap into your microphone, get a sense of the ambient noise that's around you. I can tap into the Bluetooth sensor to see how many other people are around. So it's really now getting this much richer understanding of the person, but also the person in context. And if you take that even more to the extreme, where I think this is going in the not too far future, is that, and companies are working on this already, is that we'll have contact lenses, for example, or glasses, whatever that looks like, that not just capture everything that we see like in real time, but then also kind of give us somewhat hyper-personalized information, kind of projected back onto the retina that says, okay, based on who you are, based on the context, here's some information that you might be interested in. So if we're worried about echo chambers at the moment, talking about Facebook and how we're just living in these bubbles, I think this would really be the next step, where our reality might be so different from, or my reality might be so different from yours, that we're not even talking about the same thing anymore. So it's just something that I think is worth keeping in mind. And with that, I'm gonna stop here, and I'm also going to move quickly and get a charger because my laptop is dying. Oh, no. So bear with me. Got it. Okay. Give me 1 second. But you can, I'm super happy if someone already has a question to answer that. I can do the multitasking.
Okay. I have a question that I found interesting. Your comment earlier on in your lecture about big data, criticisms of big data, and then your perspective that it's not either or, use big data or another kind of approach or method. So I was thinking about, what is your perspective? Do you consider like maybe using big data as a preliminary approach to a more streamlined study versus like a mixed methodology type of perspective? Could you talk just a little bit? I know it's not specific necessarily to what you presented research-wise, but it's an important issue.
I think it's a super important question. And I think there's many different ways in which you can actually work with it, right? So sometimes I start with big data set. So sometimes I just get a data set. I'm like, oh, this is super interesting. And now let me think of questions that I can answer with that data set. So oftentimes, even the hypotheses that I generate are just driven by the data that I have, but there's some interesting patterns that I see in that data. And then I'm like, oh, this is an interesting phenomenon. Let's try and test these theories more thoroughly in the lab. And there's other time, and I think this is something that we are oftentimes not used to, right? So the way that we've been trained as psychologists is that you kind of go through the literature, you identify a gap, then you kind of think about your hypotheses and you kind of plan out your entire kind of set of studies. And so it goes counter this idea, because it takes the data first, it finds something empirical, and then you start theorizing around this pattern that you find. So that's one way that I find fascinating, because it's so much, it's like, for me, it's just really fun. So I have a data set I can play around with, and I'm not limited to my own thinking. I'm just like, here's something interesting that I find, and now I can start theorizing. But it's also sometimes the case that I have some lab data, or I've already explored something. And then the question is, well, does that generalize to the real world, right? So that's usually the question that kind of comes up by reviewers. It's oftentimes something that we have in our limitation section, which is like, it's great that it works in the lab, we understand its effect now, but does it really make a difference in the real world? So I think those are the two streams that oftentimes happen in my work. Either I start with big data and then I find something interesting, or I find something interesting and then I'm like, okay, big data could help me to see if this works when we kind of take it into the wild.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask another question because I don't see anything in the chat, but folks, feel free to put questions in the chat. Your studies related to individuals' personalities and the personalities of those in their environment and how that relates to spending. Did you find, or have you found that there's certain personality variables like the extroversion or extroverts who are more likely to be influenced by, the spending, the behavior, the opinions of those around them, and in a way are conformist to some degree in order to maintain like their social connections and their social circles? And is kind of that those other variables driving it? Just your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a super interesting question. So we haven't looked at it empirically. My intuition would be that whatever is socially, so I've kind of thought about it in a little bit in the context of authenticity, right? So it is like I have a paper on that looks at how close is your online presentation. So how close is the profile that we can predict from your Facebook likes and status updates? How close is that to how you describe yourself? And does that have an impact on your well-being? And one of the questions that came up in this context, which I think is also relevant to your question, was this idea, well, for some people, it's just much easier to be authentic and just spend their money in line with their own personality. So if you're extroverted and it's extroverted is what is socially desirable, and that could be at a broader scale, that could be at a local scale, then actually that just aligns two different motives. That aligns your self-verification motive because you're extroverted. So you're spending money in line with who you are. But if everybody else is also extroverted, then you also kind of attune yourself to the social context, right? And you're kind of, what you would do is also what everybody else would do. So now you have these two forces pulling together. If it's an introvert in an extroverted context, that should make it much harder because now the introverted self motive of verification is, okay, I should spend my money on something that's introverted, but I also have a social motive that says I should attune my spending with what everybody else is doing. So now these pull in opposite directions. So I think there are potentially certain personality traits that are more attuned to what other people think of them. And I could imagine extroversion is one of them. But I think what's the interesting part is really this idea of like how closely aligned is your own personality to whatever is happening in this local social context, right? So that's part of the reason why we do see these personality traits cluster in the first place, because people selectively move to locations where they kind of fit in. So if you're an introvert, it's much easier to live your life in an introverted environment. I think the strongest intuition comes from politics. Like if you're like introversion, extroversion is like a little bit diffused, but if you're a liberal, it's much harder to live your life in an extremely conservative area. And as a conservative, it's much harder to live your life in an extremely liberal area. So people selectively move into these kind of places and neighborhoods and social contexts where their own motivation is essentially aligned with the motivation of other people such that they can pull in them in the same direction.
Makes sense. Thank you. So Riley Berhana has, I think, a comment and a question. I found it interesting that you were not only researching the spending side, but also the saving side. It's kind of like you were on both sides of the battle. Wanted to know if that's something you think about when deciding what you were going to focus your research on.
It very much is. That's an excellent question. So, I mean, it's funny because the Cambridge Analytica scandal certainly helped me get a job. So I can't say that I'm super sad that it ever happened because it helped like put this thing on people's radar and it got a lot of attention. But for me, it obviously also meant that I started thinking a ton about ethics. So I've written a lot about ethics, about how we should be regulating these technologies, but not just that. So it also made me really think about the positive sides, right? So if you argue that technology is a tool that allows you to go in both directions, and there's a quote, it's Kranzberg's first law of technology, which says that technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And I think that's totally true, right? So it's a tool, and whether it's good or bad entirely depends on how you use it. So I started thinking about how can we rail in the negative side so that it doesn't get manipulated, but also how can we ramp up the positive side? Because if we can understand human motivation, there's so much potential there, right? Like this could be saving. There's other work that I'm doing right now, which is trying to get college students stay in college, which is like when I heard the numbers for the first time, it was crazy to me. Like more than 50% of students don't finish their degrees. And coming from Europe, first of all, the entire system in the US is crazy how expensive it is. And then having this understanding of like people spend this money, they don't finish their degree, so they accumulate that and there's no way for them to ever easily pay this back. It's terrible, right? So if we, in this case, if we can predict using digital footprints, for example, if someone is likely to drop out, and we can then use this information of like, how are they embedded in the network? What are the things that they care about to get them to continue with their studies and feel more embedded in the network and feel more supported by the university? That's an amazing application. If we can detect early signs of depression and then point people in the right direction and tell them, look, this is a rough spot to be in because you're probably not likely to reach out and get the help that you need because that's part of the disease. So here's some support that you can get from your network, from people who know what they're doing at an early stage when you haven't fully entered a depressive episode. Amazing. But it's so there's a lot of thinking that goes into this idea of control, right? Who has control? Are we nudging behavior in the direction that you wanted to go in anyway? Or are we nudging behavior in the direction that we wanted to go in, but you don't necessarily want to go in? And that's, I think, the way that I've been thinking about this the most is, can I do something that helps you on the way to where you want to go? And we know that it's so hard for people to exercise more, diet, because all of this is in the future and it requires a sacrifice in the now. So if we can help you on that path, by making some of your motivations more salient, by playing into your individual needs and preferences, so much potential.
So we're at 12:02. If you're okay with one more question. Dr. Semizar asks, or says, your work on personality and spending behavior in the UK is quite interesting. Would you be able to direct us to the personality database?
Yeah, so the personality database, I don't know exactly what the URL is. I'm happy to circulate it, but essentially if you Google BBC, Big Five personality, and maybe Cambridge University, you should be able to get to that data set. And the way that it works, so the personality data set that has like all the locations associated with it, you have to request access, but as a researcher, you're going to get it.
Okay.
So it's not publicly available, but it's available on request.
Wonderful. Thank you for this really interesting lecture, Dr. Matz. I have so many more questions, but I follow up with you at another time.
Yes.
I really appreciate you making the time to speak with us today and being part of this seminar. So the next seminar is with Dr. Semizar, who's one of the cyber psychology faculty members at NJIT. And her talk is Monday, April 19th, also 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And the title of her talk is Understanding Human Visual Perception and Its Limitations, the role of visual clutter on naturalistic search tasks. So please join us for that. Register for eBright. Again, Dr. Matz, many thank yous. And see you all at the next seminar.
Bye.
Bye now.